You don't need me to bippity boppity boop the wheelbarrow out of the frame?
No.
No? Okay. Hello and welcome back. This week I'm very excited to announce that I'm taking part in Twist in Time magazine's October blog tour, celebrating Juliet Vandermolen's book, Confess, The Untold Story of Dorothy Good. This is a book that is a historical look at the life of Dorothy Good, who happens to be the youngest ever person accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials. What's really interesting about this book, however, is that it's told through poetry. So rather than just simply being a historical story about it or historical fiction or a biography, it's told through poetry, which gives it a really interesting emotional aspect that I wasn't expecting. Of course, in order to give some context to the overall story of Dorothy Good, Vandermolen does include an introduction in which he kind of explains a little bit about the Salem witch trials, a little bit about Dorothy, a little bit about how her confession essentially condemned her mother to death. And then the poems, which are really interesting, that explains her time kind of like right before witchcraft, or rather being accused of it, during the trials, and it kind of explores a little bit after. I was also super fortunate to have interviewed Vandermolen, so definitely check out the link to that in the description below. I'll include that. And it was just incredibly fascinating because I think even if you like historical fiction or historical nonfiction or creative nonfiction, there's a certain, like, not so much a lack of emotional connection, because I think that's too strong, but I think that the fact that it's told through poetry is just so much more evocative in a different way. Like, I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but I do think, and Vandermolen kind of alluded to this in her interview, spoilers, it's that poetry is just such a unique way to look at things, and it's a unique way to process emotions and feelings that you don't necessarily get through prose. Because, at least the way that I look at it, while an author using prose might give you some freedoms, like in Neo Striker, I don't think I mentioned this in the blog, but in one of the appendices, J.D. Niles said, I didn't want to give this character super specific descriptions of how they looked because I wanted the reader to come up with that for themselves, because I wanted that character to be like the ideal girl. And so even though prose authors may give readers like a little bit of leeway that way, like not give you all the details, they're still giving you way more information and way more detail than there is in poetry, unless it's like one of those Red Little Wagon kind of poems. But even then, like, there's just so much latitude for personal, individual understanding and interpretation that I think is really powerful. And since poetry is a very, I think it's a very emotive form of literature and writing in general, the fact that Vandermolen uses this just makes Dorothy seem that much more human, and it makes her story that much more sad. I mean, she's this little child who is accused of witchcraft. Her mother's accused of witchcraft. She's torn away from her mother. She's manipulated into condemning her mother to death, and she has to live with that trauma. And because you got to remember, the Salem witch trials happened in the 1600s, and let's be real, mental health wasn't really like a huge concern until not that long ago. So the tools that Dorothy would have had, I'm sorry, there's a breeze. The tools that Dorothy would have had in order to deal with her trauma would have been extremely limited. And kind of on that note, I don't know if Dorothy did write any poetry or did journal or something, but to me it almost kind of felt like Vandermolen's poems were Dorothy's way of letting things out, if that kind of makes sense. Like, because since all those poems are from her perspective, like, it seems very personal, and it seems like that would have been the way to work through those feelings of trauma and figuring out who one is, and figuring out that just because something happened to you, you don't necessarily have to be defined by that. But yeah, I mean, the poems are beautifully written. The poems are emotional and evocative and very powerful. Like, there's one poem that I did really like, and also Vandermolen mentioned it too, how it's at one point when she's like, you know what, if you're going to accuse me of witchcraft, then like hex on you. The name is escaping me at the moment because I don't have the book in front of me, but it's just kind of funny, and really, funny is not quite the right word, but it's really interesting to kind of see this character work through all those feelings. I really enjoyed it. I think I would have been really interested to see it in the form of historical creative nonfiction or historical fiction. But honestly, I'm really glad that Vandermolen did choose to write it in poetry, because I think it's a very unique perspective, and it gives it a different outlook, and it definitely humanizes Dorothy, because let's face it, like, when you're in middle school, high school history class and the Salem witch trials come up, it's maybe for a blip, maybe a day, if that. And even though you hear, oh, X number of people were accused, X number of people died, like, you don't really hear those names. And what I also think is really powerful is that at the end of the book, Vandermolen includes an entire list of all the people who were accused and all the people who passed. And I think that's also just really powerful, because it's so important to know our national history, and to know, even more than that, our global history. And it's really dangerous to forget about it, or to say, oh, that's not happening anymore. Like, we're still condemning people for things that they can't control, or for needless things. And so I don't think that this book is inherently political in spite of that, but I think books like this are really important in a political sense, because it's important to remember that they're people too. They have thoughts, they have feelings, they have fears. They need love too. And and maybe that's just one more reason why I think poetry was a really interesting and really good choice for this story, because since it's just so emotional, you see that she's a person. Like, there's no doubt about it. So I definitely recommend this book. Check it out. I'll link Twist in Time in the description below. I'll link Juliet in the link below. But I really think that you'll enjoy this book, and I hope you check it out. That's all I have for Confess. Next week, I'm excited because I'll be reviewing Twitter friend Jay Plosker's book, An Audible Silence. I'm very excited to check it out and come back and share my thoughts. Thanks.